Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the February 22nd edition of the KNI Sync. This is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which effectively boils down to be nice to one another. So please do be nice to one another. In order to help organize questions and interjections and stuff as we have discussions, please try to use the raise hand feature in Zoom. It makes it easier for us to kind of keep people organized and make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. We do appreciate, and I already see plenty of people putting their names on the attendees list, especially for something like this, where it's a just an idea right now. It's very good to be able to measure kind of like who's involved, what orgs are involved, stuff like that. This helps us keep in contact with you as we're doing things, as we're making new PRs, that kind of thing. This is an open agenda meeting. We only have a few items on the agenda for today. If you want to add something, please add it at any time during this meeting to the bottom of the thing. If at some point we can't get to an agenda item, we'll roll it over into the next meeting. With that, at the last meeting, we had a lot to say. If there's anybody here that wants to take a couple minutes, like I'll take a sip of water here. If anybody wants to take a couple seconds and just say like who they are, why they're here, what excites them about the prospect, what things they want to bring to the table, please do. We'd love to hear from you.
I guess I can go ahead and start. I'm Ben Leggett. I work at Solo. I'm an Istio maintainer, and I've done a lot of CNI work on that side and some additional small bits internally on Cilium CNI as well. So that kind of exposed me to the current state of things and sort of opened my eyes to like, yeah, we could do this a little bit better. And there are several outstanding bugs in at least the Istio side, probably in others, that this could fix just out of the gate. So excited about that.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you for sharing. If nobody else, anybody else?
Yeah, I'll go. I'm Kurt Bushko. I work at HashiCorp on the console service mesh. Written some CNI plugins, so I just want to see what I can help out with and see what the next evolution of Kubernetes networking can be.
Yeah, also very cool.
I'll throw in my 10 cents. I'm Pete White. I work for Microsoft, a little company you might have heard of. Although I've come through there from a rather strange background in telco networking and writing software for telco networking. So a lot of multi-network Kubernetes stuff going on. So I'm very interested in that. And that's led to the view that Kubernetes networking could be much better. And it looks like KNI could make it much better. So I'm quite excited from that perspective of just, it'll do the same stuff much better. And then we can do more stuff.
Right on.
I'll take it away. My name is Doug Smith. I am involved in the Network Plumbing Working Group, a number of faces I know from that area. And also one of our reference implementations is Multis CNI. And something that we've observed over a number of years is that people try to use Multis CNI as a Kubernetes-enabled CNI runtime. And it's not really what it's designed for. So it's really kind of hammered at home to me that we need to bridge the gap here for Kubernetes integration with network plugins. And I see KNI as a like real boon to move that effort forward. So I'm psyched.
Let me
Very,
go
very cool.
next.
Yeah, go
can
for
you hear
it.
me? Yep. I'm Tomohumi Hayashi from Red Hat. I'm in Tokyo, so it's pretty midnight. Anyway, I'm the maintainer of the Multis CNI as well as the CNI community, CNCF. And I'm of course interested in the KNI because this is, how do I say, we through the Multis experience as well as CNI, sometimes I feel that there is several gap between the CNI and then the Kubernetes, and then we could have a better way to have a more flexible network interface manipulation as well as the network manipulations. So I'm believing that the KNI is the one of the solutions, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Very cool. Lots of Multis representation. Cool.
I'll probably say next. I'm Alexander Kanievsky. My team and myself, we are mostly working in the area of resource management and like runtimes. So my interest is more about improving the communication between all the Kubernetes and, well, actually CNCF components. So like what is done in kubelet, how the CRI API looks like, how a runtime is split work. So KNI is one of the parts which I want to improve in long term, like to have explicit declarations of a parts of a protocol instead of implicit how it's currently hidden in run pod sandbox.
Roger that. Go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to ask, Alexander, are you involved with the DRA stuff?
Not directly anymore. So I was, I would say, like godfather of it. So we started with discussion in, I don't know, like 5 years about go together with NVIDIA, with Renault. I did the prototype, but afterwards it was handed over to Patrick. So Patrick is the main person right now. I'm still participating in some of the discussions, but I'm quite away from it at the moment.
Just asking because I feel like that's one of the facets or overlapping Kubernetes networking plots, whatever, that we seem to not have a representative of here.
Yes, we actually, I think myself, Patrick, and Marcus from our team, we came to SIG-Network some time ago. We tried to propose using DRA as a basis for like representing some of the network use cases, especially like for multi-network scenarios. But at that time, the discussion was like, what like DRA is good, but we want something more and something our own defined. So, yeah.
Very cool. Anyone else? Well, we go ahead.
Sorry, maybe I'm the last one. My name is Peter Bind. I'm from Nokia. I'm lead architect and responsible for cloud infrastructure. And we had facing a lot of issues relating to using Mutus in Google or AWS or any other cloud deployment. And this is the reason why joining this meeting to see what will come next and how it can be better for us. Yeah.
Very much appreciate you coming. Very cool. Well, we have a lot of different perspectives represented. I put some takeaways about some of the perspectives and stuff like that. Some of them are more obvious than others. But we really appreciate people like coming and then telling us a little bit about where you're coming from. And we want to make sure that we're being helpful in supporting you and getting your equity in this project and this idea that hopefully will become a project. So thank you all for piping up. We appreciate that. All right, I'm going to share the agenda and the next thing on the agenda here. If you can see the agenda, sometimes Linux Zoom is a little weird. Is it visible? Yes, no? See it? I'm going to assume. Yeah, okay.
Yep.
All right. Then just a little bit of a recap of kind of what's happened since the last time we talked and just where we're at. The KEP draft KEP has kind of been inundated with comments. There's a lot of good conversation going on there. We appreciate everyone jumping in there. There are some things that kind of need to be sussed out a little bit, like trying to focus on very specific actions. But I think the biggest thing that we keep seeming to come back around to is the need to make sure that our user stories, our goals are as clear as they can be as we move forward and hopefully take it out of draft. Thank you to everybody who's jumped in, and for anybody here who hasn't jumped into that KEP yet, there is a link. It's actually in the next thing here, but there's a link to it there, and we'd love to have people join in and just kind of be like, if nothing else, take a look at it and see if it resonates with you, and if it doesn't, tell us how, and tell us about your use cases and like your interests and stuff like that. Mike, do you want to add anything in terms of recapping kind of what's been going on recently?
Yeah, I think you covered it. I think it was just solidifying the goals and the user stories and keeping the rest out for now, which could be like the design and more. Um, and you're also lagging a little bit. You may need to turn your video off. You may also not even be there anymore.
I'm here. I'm here.
Oh,
Thank you for the
okay,
heads up.
cool.
I am lagging a little bit. Go ahead, Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know if Mike was still going. So I was going to say, in terms of user stories, user stories are technically an optional part of the CAP, right? There are kind of two sorts of things that we might be doing. For fixing the network architecture for ourselves, we don't really need user stories as much because we're the users. And we can just sort of write what we need to do. The user stories are more for when we're writing a feature for actual Kubernetes users to use. And the users aren't directly participating in the KEP process. So we need to have the user stories there as sort of a proxy for the actual users. I feel like KNI is mostly about fixing things for ourselves, and so the user stories are less important, although we still need a very clear definition of what problems we're solving. But depending on how far we're getting from CNI 1.0 and whatever, it may be more end users versus us. What are you going to say, Mike?
I was just asking a question, yeah, because if the user stories are optional, we may be able to save this for our user story discussion. Is like where on the CAP, and I know the CAP kind of is more like a template and a guideline and not the way. Or should that be in the goals, or should we add like another section to be explicitly saying, this is the problem we're trying to solve? Because I kind of tried doing that in the goals, but it kind of felt like I was shoving the square peg through the triangle in a way, and it probably is coming across that way in the CAP right now.
There's always a little bit of that in the CAP because we use CAPs for so many different sorts of problems. But in general, the motivation section as a whole is where you should be explaining that. And you can, like, if you look at the NF tables Q proxy one, like the motivation section, I had like 12 subsections there. Like, you can add more organization. You can add more subsections than the CAP template has if that helps you to present the problem and the solution better.
Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah, because I did expand on the motivation, and I promise I will shorten the lines, and go from there. Because that's helpful. Because yeah, I think from the user story perspective, it was getting a little tricky to conflate the developer versus a user story and more.
At the same time, and despite the fact that it is potentially, especially if we're looking for like just going to parity with some general improvements, something more for ourselves, I think personally it's that the user story exercises that we're trying to do are very important because of the reach of what we're doing, and because to some degree the CNI was created in, I mean, something, I wouldn't say it was created in a vacuum, but I would say that it was created with a smaller group and with less Kubernetes users at a time when Kubernetes was newer. Kubernetes is vast. It is, basically cross-continental, used everywhere in the world now. And making sure that we have user stories as part of the earliest part of the process to help make sure that we're being inclusive and making sure that we're not missing any very specific thing that then later we're like, ah, crap, I think has value. But I don't think you were advocating against user stories either. I just wanted to re-emphasize what I think the value of doing them is, even if they're technically not required.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely not diminishing the need for the user story. I think they are very important. Just one, I have my background is all Scrum, so I see the value of them as well. So I mean, they could be optional because I do like. I mean, I think we should put them in there, but I think we should definitely make a valiant attempt to have our user stories and probably our developer focused user stories or a breakdown of that nature, especially if when we start implementing. I think that'll be helpful.
Yeah.
What, yeah, what I was saying, specifically, we still need clear problem statements. It's just the user story framing isn't always as useful in the case where the developers already understand the problem and don't need to refer back to what users might be trying to do. Like if we find that the motivation section already explains everything, then you don't necessarily need user stories on top of that.
Indeed, I'm with you. Cool. Anybody else have anything in terms of like just kind of recapping what's been going on lately? Anything in the recapping kind of space here?
Has anybody ran the demo lately or played with it, implemented it?
I have not. It's on my backlog to do, but I have not.
Cool.
I think
Well,
Doug's.
that actually leads in a little bit to my next. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say Doug Smith might have been taken away by his housework, but he had been trying to implement libkni into Maltus as a fun little effort.
Yeah, and we're looking into, and this will lead into what my thing next, but we're looking into potentially implementing KNI in Blixt as kind of just an additional POC, something fun to do. Not yet though. Just on the horizon. Probably after KubeCon. KubeCon's always such a... All right, I'll jump into the next topic and stop me if anybody wants to talk about anything else as far as like things that have gone on in recent history. So this kind of follows up on that, the demo. So Mike and I actually went through the demo a little bit yesterday. I guess I should probably preface this. I think most people in here probably understand this, but I want to make sure that it's abundantly clear. We are really just at a KEP and a draft one at that, and it's not even in like provisional state, right? We're at an idea stage, but Mike and I believe very strongly in prototyping as part of the early development process. So there does exist a POC, a demo, which expresses one idea of how you might implement the Kubernetes networking interface. We're not married to it. It's a POC. It could potentially change significantly, go away. It's all in flux, but it's there to help illustrate. So that's what he was talking about. If you haven't run the demo, Mike, if you wouldn't mind adding links to the demo here in the agenda, go take a look. It's fairly straightforward to set up. It just includes a forked version of Kubernetes with KNI, basically gRPC callbacks in the kubelet to a KNI implementation, and then there is a demo KNI implementation as well. That'll help illustrate one of the ways in which we could go, but it is not. We are not like dead set on going that way. It's just an important part of the process so the most important thing to do right now is to talk about the goals and stuff like that. The what and the why rather than the how is more important. We have a little bit of the potential how, but we want to downplay it as like, don't think we're married to it. So yeah, if you're interested in that stuff, it's there. So we were looking at the demo yesterday and kind of going through things and talking about how Blix could potentially implement it and so forth. And one thing that I thought about and I mentioned and we talked about at some length, decided to just bring up for consideration here is that right now it's gRPC callbacks from kubelet, which is already showing some. Go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to ask, I thought Blixt was a gateway API implementation.
Currently.
So what does it mean for it to implement KNI? What does it...
For it to also become a CNI-like thing.
Okay, so it basically turning Blixt into two separate things that are in one.
Yeah.
Component.
If we continue to use eBPF, in the way that we're using it now, actually becoming a KNI or CNI like thing helps to reduce the hackiness of how Blix currently works. Because Blix, for those that don't know, is a kind of a for fun project that is not meant to be used in production. In fact, it's kind of, it blocks you from using it in production. And it's been a kind of a fun project where we were looking at like eBPF and implementing Gateway API. One of the main original use cases was to help support the development of layer 4 support in Gateway API. But it's already playing at like the kernel level, low level networking and stuff like that, and dealing with things like routing TCP packets and stuff like that. So it's potentially in a space where it could do this. And so we were considering maybe we would just do it for fun. If nothing else, to kind of do an exercise for ourselves and see how hard it is to implement that kind of thing. But okay, so what I was getting at though is that there are potential drawbacks to using gRPC in this way. One of them is that you can get into kind of a locking situation, which Mike and I were talking about yesterday, where it's a lot harder to avoid locking up on failure conditions. And the other one is there may be some performance and scalability issues reached when you're at like certain levels. Like if you are absolutely thrashing on pods, set up and tear down, there could be some performance concerns. So I was throwing out the idea that we already have the concept that we're going to have Kubernetes APIs for networks and networking configuration as part of KNI. We want that. That's one of the goals. And if we have that, and then we also have these gRPC callbacks, effectively Kubelet is just watching the API and then converting the API into these callbacks. Maybe there's some room to just have KNI implementations be more like a regular controller and watch the API, wait for the kubelet to kind of do a handoff through status for network setup, do that setup, and then update the status and move on. Just a thought. And it's added to like ongoing considerations in the KEP. So there's a link there that shows that. And I think we wanted to throw that out there to those who are kind of maybe not, we don't want to obviously focus too much on how we do things, but for those who currently implement CNI, very curious to hear feedback on that. Like if that sounds appealing, if that sounds problematic, etc. So I just wanted to bring that up. Go ahead, Dan.
I think anytime we can use the API objects and the API server to implement things, we should.
Yeah.
We need to think through the implications of it, because there's sometimes trickiness with implementing the network and talking over the network. And I think this probably doesn't add any more confusion there, but because this would probably mostly all be done by host network processes anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah.
In
general, it
cool,
seems like a good idea.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, that was the spirit of it. Go ahead, I think Mike.
Yeah, as discussed yesterday, we did state that this would explicitly be something that happens before create containers. So obviously the pod would not come up without a network. And I think the things that we're kind of, noodling on via messages, well, one is, support for service mesh. And then, what about multiple actors to transition this pod to the next state, and then possibly what would be the implications of multiple updates to the pod object to transition said state, if that would add an additional burden to the process. I think those were kind of like the highlights. And I know we could also say is like, what about the TCP connection to Kube API? I think that's almost irrelevant simply because every Kubernetes network plugin already is doing this. So we get at least one TCP connection in my eyes here.
Yeah, roger that. Benjamin?
Yeah, from my perspective, like the main thing that like I need the CNI to do is to block pod scheduling until networking is quote unquote ready, right? On that node for that pod. The life cycle stuff is sort of, when we do it is up to debate, I guess. But like I need from ISTEO's perspective, like we want to be able to know that the pod will not be scheduled until the KNI agent is, or whatever, is A, on the node, B, healthy, and C, actually ran. And we need that to be like a firm guarantee. So any model that like can fulfill that is fine. I would think that like the gRPC thing seems initially logically simpler. Having everything consult a shared resource would probably also work if we could, like, as long as we could ensure that it's also like a simple model and scales well, which that's be my main concern, I guess. But I don't know enough. But either, as long as the actual requirement of pod is not scheduled until CNI and whatever extensions it is executing completes is held, as long as that's still holds true, any mechanism will probably work for us.
Roger that. That's great feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, you raise a good point about because there is like kind of like a network ready status on the node in question. So that would still be in play because we don't want to start scheduling pods until it's ready. And I think some part of it was, once we schedule a pod, that there's various states that we could go through here to say, like, pod is, for lack of better words and just for ideas, that there's like, the pod is ready for network provisioning. And then
Right.
this other little item process is watching these pods to set it up on that node specifically and then transition it to the next state. And one thing that came out of that style, a train of thought was that, right now we have an issue kind of with IPAM. So if you exhaust all your IP addresses, you kind of just go into this endless crash loop. And in that case, we could pivot it around and say that, I'd rather be in a state that says, waiting for, network or whatever, versus my pod going into this endless
crash loop. Right. Yeah.
So
that's fair.
That was one thing. But I understand. Is like we want to make sure that we're setting the node ready in a state, or that idea of network ready goes away entirely and your pods can just sit and waiting for whatever or anything.
With better status reporting potential. Yeah, that's fine. And like I think that can be like actually a UX discussion. But as far as like security guarantees for meshes and stuff, like we need to know that the node is ready. If, for instance, you're in a dynamic scaling environment, maybe and everything is not moved to it's scheduled on a new node yet, and also that we know that the pod will not be scheduled until certain criteria around network configuration are met, so that it doesn't run and let traffic escape. For instance, if we want to do MTLS and we're telling people MTLS is enabled, but stuff hasn't finished running yet, so the pod starts up and leaks.
100%. Yeah, the service mesh was the main point that I was kind of noodling on yesterday. I was like, today it's all synchronous. Like, if the CNI ad were to fail, the pod doesn't come up and the ISTIOs and all chain onto the primary. So it's just something we have to consider is like, if we adopt this model, we have like, say, for lack of better words, we have a flannel and then we have ITSIO. And how do we guarantee that the pod comes up? Because the requirement for the service meshes on like pod scheduling is that you do your work after the primary interface is attached in the network namespace. So there's something we got to consider.
It's something to consider, but I would also say I am fine with de-scoping that a little bit for now, because we have that problem with current CNI. And if we're talking about KNI as a direct replacement, as long as we can say, like, for instance, the primary CNI has to be ready before anything can be scheduled on that node, that's good enough, because that's current status quo. Like Istio can continue, or whoever else can continue to work around issues where like maybe our extension is not ready yet or whatever. Like that could arguably be a secondary concern. I would like to improve that story,
But it's a fair point that the current implementation does not solve for that either. So if we want one-to-one parity with what's already out there as the initial goal, I'm fine descoping that or kicking that down the road if we need to. Because I do agree that I think I want this to be, in terms of like and I left a comment on the PR, in terms of like extensions and plugins, I want this to be as good as the current status quo in terms of what you can do with it. And then we can later go on to how can it be better. But yeah.
Indeed. I was just going to add on, and I think it just adds right on to what Mike was saying. So Mike and I were talking yesterday, and he's thinking a lot about the service mesh use case. And he was thinking about in the gRPC API, I'm kind of recapping a little bit of what Mike was saying, sorry, but in the gRPC service API, adding some methods that would be in service of like basically allowing for hooks so that you could, okay. Maybe I don't need to say anything more, but I thought that was very wise that we enable hooks so that people can hook in. Unfortunately, as many upsides as there are to using a watch mechanism and like having KNI implementations be more like a standard controller and using resources so that the visibility is way up for the user.
Yeah.
The hooking part gets a little harder here. It's a little more complicated, I think.
Yeah,
but that's all stuff we can work out later.
Yeah. I do think though that hooking is like what I feel like that's an underappreciated part of current CNI that is like that is all very decoupled and that is leveraged by multiple vendors in a lot of cute ways. And I think we have to kind of at least meet the need there to some degree.
Yeah, at least parity, minimum parity. Yeah. Cool. Very cool. All good thoughts. Thank you, Kurt, for taking notes. I really appreciate that. Good notes. Cool. So yeah, just wanted to bring that one up. It is a little bit more on the how kind of side of things, which is good to talk a little bit about, especially since everybody here at the table is probably pretty hungry for some of the how. I think that I don't see any more hands, so I think that moves us on to our next agenda item, which was just to kind of generally try to talk a little bit more about user stories, have a discussion about user stories, have we can make that a mixture of user stories, goals, motivations. So just basically about the cap, like where the cap is at currently. So if anybody wants to take a second, I'll take a drink. Raise your hand if you want to start talking about any particular user stories you're interested in or any problems you're having with the cap right now in terms of motivation and goals and user stories. The notes aren't terrible, Kurt. They're great. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to throw out a user story then. Gateway API potentially could really benefit from the network being visible in the Kubernetes API. In particular, there's this gap, which I should have named it on here, but this is, here, I'll open it actually. So GEPs are basically KEPs for Gateway API. Gateway routability, and this basic, it's been kind of in a limbo for a while. Because it wants to do this. It wants to have like routable within a specific scope, public, private, cluster. And it's been really hard to move this forward because you can't do that very well, or at least very generally across Kubernetes today. You can't really understand what networks are there and what their scope is. This is potentially something that Gateway API could really use because in particular, Gateway API implementations have addresses, or rather the gateway resource in Gateway API will have addresses. There's addresses in the status, and this will tell you how to communicate with the gateway. Today, you figure out at a network level how you do that. We'll just give you the address, and you just have to know. And that's not necessarily great. And it doesn't allow for things like we want to do, like being able to have a private gateway or being able to have one address that is public for the gateway and one address maybe that goes to a backend API or something that's private, something like that, or being able to bind listeners only to the private address and not to the public one, etc. There's a lot of different reasons why having like a scope of networking available in the API for gateway implementations to lock onto and then say in the gateway, yep, this is on network A, network B, could be very helpful for users. So that's a user story I don't think I've actually written in yet, but one I wanted to talk about a little bit today, and then I'll probably just add it to the PR.
I have the another user stories as the the format as the following the format as the network administrator of the Kubernetes cluster. I want the verification of the network periodically for the pod, so that I could support the check API, and then once the check is failed, then the administrator could choose a way to how to fix that. I mean that including the recreating the pod or some stuff. Is that the valid use case or not? I'm a little bit wondering that.
Can you write it out?
Yeah, I don't quite get what you were saying either.
Yeah, if you write it out, that'll be probably helpful for us.
I see him on there doing that. Thank you. I want to check the pods network. And obviously there's a little bit more to it than that, but I will say that I like in the POC that there is kind of a language for querying the pod network, which is good and relates. You know what you can't do in Zoom in a web browser, at least on Linux? You can't stream audio. I was gonna when you guys came in today, I was gonna play Lionel Richie in the background quietly, see if anybody was like, what the hell?
As a fellow Linux user who has to deal with Zoom, I feel your pain. It's not great.
Thank you. I appreciate the commiseration. It's not great. It works a little bit.
It's worse than that. In Windows, they can wear silly hats and have them added, and that doesn't seem to work in Linux.
What?
That's the feature I want. Now I'm not running it in the browser. I've been running the app, but you know.
That is a crying shame. I didn't even know that existed. I've never seen anybody use it.
So I'm in calls with personal calls, a number of people who do abuse that feature continuously, which is hilarious. And I'm just sitting there, can't do that. Can't do that.
I had to get off of the app version and use the web browser version because the app kept just like pegging a CPU core. Like it would go nuts. All right. Tomo's got the whole thing written out now. As a network admin of the cluster, I want to validate or check pods network so that I can utilize KNI, which checks connectivity through check CNI command and do recover methods, restart the pod, etc. if the network has changed.
From a user's perspective, why is that important? Like, pretend you have an Nginx pod, and we need to verify the pod's network. Is this to ensure connectivity, that I'm going through the right, out the right network? I'm just trying to phrase it also from the user's perspective as well. This is a great story. I'm not trying to criticize it, but also trying to find out, how does this help the user? And that answer could be the obvious too, like I just stated. Not trying to throw a trick into inject tricks into the system.
Yeah, maybe the
If you're talking,
security was.
Tomo, oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah. Maybe the from the user's perspective, the security was some stuff. I think. I mean that if let's imagine the route is unexpectedly added. Maybe that's the some users stuff, I think.
100%. I was also thinking from a desired state perspective that, if your desired state and your actual state don't make sense anymore, that probably is, essentially valid. And Dan has his hand raised too.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like basically the ask here is that we shouldn't only look at the network at pod creation and pod destruction time, right? Like we should sort of continuously make sure that the networking configuration of the pod is
Yep.
correct in some sense.
Yeah, I think so.
This opens up the door for a lot of like self-healing controllers and operators that companies might want to run.
Yeah, that goes on to my desired state not equaling the actual state, which would be great. Do you have like a use case where something potentially happens during runtime? Or anybody that's been like, hey, I had this pod running and mysteriously someone added, I don't know, new routes. I don't know. I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head. I'm just be kind of curious if someone. I've definitely had this problem, so I'm wondering if other people have had this problem. This was in just to add some additional details. We were running customer BGP instances, and interfaces sometimes would magically just disappear, and we would sever, connectivity with the other BGP speaker.
There was an OpenShift bug report at one point where somebody was doing something. It may have been running the NM state tool, which had the side effect of destroying their CNI bridge. And so they wanted, the system to notice when that happened and fix it, which is sort of hard to do in a CNI context because you need to wait for the next pod to be created, basically. I think this is one of the user stories that led to check being added to CNI.
Very cool. Thank you, Tomo. Tomofumi or Tomo, do you prefer?
Tomo is okay.
Okay. Thank you. That sparked a lot of discussion. Anybody else have anything more to add on this?
I had a different user story, and maybe this is a little bit more high level, and it's not just to throw something out here is the obvious, or perhaps we don't need to state the obvious. In Scrum, sometimes it's important to state the obvious. Is that as a user, as a consumer of a workload, I need the ability to access my access to workload so I can use it pretty much, effectively painting the story that I need an interface with an IP address inside the pod network namespace. So I don't know if it makes sense to state the obvious, trying to mitigate my own personal, experience bias here, that I would assume that we would know that the KNI would be responsible for adding the interface into the pod network namespace. That may not be useful. It may be useful for the non-networking centric user or reader of KNI.
Indeed.
So I don't know if it makes sense to also include the obvious. I guess that was more of like a question for the group, if that would be helpful to state the obvious or just not talk about it at all. I was thinking about the individuals from other SIGs in particularly, because they may start asking, well, who sets up the network? And that user story helps drive, who is actually KNI is responsible for that.
Makes sense to me to edit the obvious.
And I say the obvious, and I just state it like mitigating my own personal biases and, experience bias, which it's not the obvious to a lot of people.
Roger that.
I don't know, Dan, do you have any thoughts on that? Like kind of I know you said earlier user stories aren't, particularly important, but they may be important to other groups. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, so the big important thing is very clearly define your problems. What you see as wrong with the current system, how you're going to solve it. user stories are a way of, bringing in the concerns of people outside the KEP process. And in fact, like Shane's thing of, oh, well, we've had this gateway problem for a while that we could solve with this. That actually is, I guess, a good example of where, that sort of comes from outside the people working on the KEP sort of, and is something that we, wouldn't be considering if he hadn't brought that up. So yeah. It's just a lot of times people sort of, they have their goals and they try to just cram those goals into user stories by writing "as a developer I want" in front of their goals, and like, don't do that. Like
Yeah, there's a balance to be had. I guess the downside in this case is that I am working on the KEP, but I think that there's value in having more people from that like outside perspective popping in.
Yeah.
And so in this case, in Tomo's case too, I think well, so for the first one, the action item is for me to go actually fill this out. And yeah, I think there's I think this will open up the idea of basically being able to see your network scope will open up the door for a lot of things. Tomo, are you interested in writing this up as part of the KEP? So we've got the KEP set up in a way that it's going to rebase merge. We are working out of Mike's branch, and the idea is that everybody can contribute directly their user stories, even if just it's one line. And if you want to, you don't have to. But we want to kind of offer it to everybody that this be everybody's KEP, so anybody who's interested can come in and contribute. And your commits won't get squashed. It'll be your stamp on the KEP.
Yep.
So if you want to write that up and add that as a PR, please do. Otherwise, we can take that forward.
Yep. So you mean that the submit a pull request to Mike's branch, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To his KNI KEP branch, which we can link here too.
I'll do that. So I
cool. We'd love to.
Wonderful that.
Awesome. And thank you for bringing this up. It brought up a lot of great conversation. And we generally just really want people to feel included in the process. So we'd love to have you jump in and kind of make PRs.
Yeah, we'll do that maybe the end of this week or some.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay. I'll write that up as an action item so we know. But we have technically 8 more minutes. If anybody has anything else that they wanted to kind of talk about in terms of user story discussions or goals and motivation.
I want to say a couple of words. I put it in the chat, but I want to raise it also by voice. So in all the discussions, what I hear right now, it's all about can be summarized with I have my own daemon which can introspect or use any kind of out of band communication channel to enter in the network namespace of a pod and do some modifications. And that works for normal containers, normal Linux world, run cbaked and similar. But when we have Kata or similar VM-based VMs, whatever you do on the host, it's not necessarily what it's enough to do inside the VM, some preparation step, especially injecting new network interfaces or something. So when we are talking about KNI or whatever other things, we need to make sure what this kind of implementation details do not assume a lot of things. So do not assume what it will be only single namespace. Do not assume what you have out of band access to all bits and pieces of a workload. It might be hidden from you. And especially if it comes to confidential containers where VM is created once and afterwards it's really hard to introduce new things. So for example, adding new network interface is almost impossible at that scenario.
Gotcha.
Just thoughts.
Yeah. Doug?
I will also take this to the chat too, but instead of belabor it now, but I have some thoughts about having some kind of configurability for having an ecosystem of runtimes right? So like, what if I am trying to manage like integrating a number of KNI solutions? So I want to have something to, a way to manage that. So I'm going to rebase this pull request and then bring it to our chat channel, and we can chat about this too, but I'll bring it another time as well, so we can give other people a chance to talk here too.
Roger that. Zappa?
Yeah, so I want to address both Alex and then Doug's points. So yeah, part of the original thought was to support virtualized in, or well, as they called like namespaced and kernel isolated pods, aka your run C pods where it's a network namespace, or kata in this case that uses still the pod network namespace and its own individualized kernel. And I actually did solicit some feedback from the kata folks in the initial KNI API. So we should certainly chat, because those were, items that should be first class citizens, especially, if you were a reader of the code in the container runtime, understanding that where the network setup, the additional network setup happens for, say, kata, is via the start task operation from the containerd perspective. So most people don't actually know that kata is doing additional network setup in that kernel, and then more network setup in its kernel that it spins up as well. So from the network namespace, then its other kernel. And I think the idea here was to uniform this process. So from a reader of the code, it'd be very intuitive to know exactly where the network setup is happening. Is in it taking it down to this, the nuts and bolts. We're all just operating on the same resource, the network namespace here. So we should talk. And then yeah, Doug, I think you raised a great point about like the ecosystem, like how, and where you getting at with like multiple or extensions of the original, like we have the network plugin, then we have something that can register with said kubelet, or maybe the network runtime to do additional work.
Yeah, you got it. As basically my gist is, how do I put together multiple like KNI implementations? Like what does that look like when I'm trying to like weave together a number of solutions? So yeah, that captures the gist of it. Thank you.
Yeah, because that was part of like the service mesh discussion that we were having in the Slack channel yesterday or a couple days ago, is because I think from the high level, like the service meshes really don't want to be the full network plugin, and the network plugin really doesn't want to be the full service mesh. And the last thing we want to do is force the service mesh to implement an interface that only uses one function. So thus that, I think it came down, the bigger discussion was, the KNI API, we'll probably have multiple services defined in the proto, similar to the Cry API has two services defined in the proto, runtime and image. So it'll probably turn into, we have the primary, then we have an extension, the ability to register, detach, and more. But that'll be a great, yeah, when we start actually diving into the design details of how this looks like.
Roger that. We have run out of time. It's been a great discussion. If you have any follow-ups, any things that are kind of trailing thoughts that you want to continue, you can either add them to the next at the top of the doc. You can bring them up. We now have, I forgot to mention this at the top of the hour, but we now have a SIG-Network-KNI Slack channel on Kubernetes Slack. So please join there if you haven't already. And that's another place where we can pick up and continue asynchronous conversations. Thank you everyone for coming today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Everybody.
Have a good one.